Thank you so much for joining me today, Edmund. I've really been looking forward to this conversation. You and your co founder created an incredibly unique online marketplace called Ishkar. Can you take me through what inspired you to create Ishkar?
Yeah. So Ishkar was born out of living in Afghanistan for a number of years. So myself and my co-founder, we were living in Kabul, and we were extremely frustrated about how Afghanistan and other countries that have been affected by conflict were perceived um, in general in the international media. But it was at the time of the Paris attacks in France, and a number of other high-profile terrorist incidents in Europe. And we felt that with a lot of the refugees that were arriving in Europe at that time, there was a very poor understanding of where these refugees came from, and there was this perception that often they were fleeing places that were just defined by conflict and poverty, and really didn't have very much going for these countries other than very few positive aspects. And so we wanted to launch a company which would change the way a lot of the world viewed these countries. So we started out by selling high-end craftsmanship. And then we've recently moved into travel as well. So we take small groups of tourists to Afghanistan, Pakistan, Mali, Yemen, lots of different parts of the world where tourists usually don't go, to show them firsthand how culturally rich a lot of these places are, and how much depth and history and character they have beyond the traditional narratives that we read about in the press.
Um, that's incredible. I One of the things you said I just want to pull out is that you're doing that I think is really important is there is a narrative that is talked about for these countries, and it's a very singular narrative. And anytime a narrative is singular, it robs the listener and that whoever the narrative is about of the dimensionality that actually exists there
Mm. Yeah,
and the beauty that exists there, right?
yeah, yeah,
And so what you're doing is actually showing different sides of these countries that the rest of the world often isn't exposed to because it's boiled down to a singular narrative of conflict.
yeah. That's absolutely right. And I think, yeah, what we're trying to do in our work, we travel we walk a very difficult path in many ways, because our message is not that these places um, are completely free of problems. That it's not that they have nothing but rich culture and history. Um, our message is that they do have rich culture and history. And yes, there are terrible wars going on. And yes, a lot of in Afghanistan, large parts of Afghanistan, there's still extreme poverty, very like women's rights are way behind other parts of the world, and there's still a lot of progress to be made. But what we're trying to do is tell a more nuanced story, which often gets lost in simple headlines that people pick up.
Now, on your website, you say, and I love this, we do what humans have done forever, trading objects, telling stories, and traveling beyond our own frontiers. And I think this is so beautifully simple and grounding of a description, kind of rooting back into human nature, the way that we have for eons explored the world and interacted with people and had authentic relationships and trade relationships with people.
I'm glad you picked up on that. Yeah, I think our through that phrase, what we're trying to also set ourselves in opposition to is this idea that's often found, I think, in particularly in social enterprise, that you always need to do something new and innovative to create a difference. And actually, we see, what our work is exactly that. We're following very well tied and trusted business models, and through those business models, we're not trying to do anything particularly innovative of itself, but we're bringing together different business streams in a new way. And so, yeah, we're trying to kind of set ourselves off in opposition to a lot of new brands which sell these grand visions of doing something that's completely new, or it's disruptive, or it's trying to break old modes of doing things. And we're trying to say in quite a modest way that we're not trying to do that. Actually, we're trying to follow in the footsteps of people who have done great impact work in the past and just carry the baton on a bit further.
I love that. It reminds me of a book actually called Hitmakers, where kind of the thesis of it is, and it talks mainly about music and consumer goods, but the magic sauce of making a hit, something that people like, is mixing what people are used to, what's expected, with an element of surprise. So not going straight to everything as a surprise, but having this balance where, okay, I'm familiar with this, but there's also something that is a bit of a surprise, which is really quite beautifully what you're doing.
Yeah, I think that's a really nice way of putting it. Yeah, yeah.
So how would you actually describe the mission of Ishkar?
So to put it simply, we want to change the way the world views countries that have been impacted by conflict, and that's our overarching goal. Under that goal come a number of separate missions. One of the most important of which is, often in countries which are affected by conflict, because there are negative perceptions of these places, trade often falls apart as soon as conflict arrives, and so a lot of the parts of the world where we work are very isolated from international markets, very isolated from trade, they're very isolated from tourism. And so our hope is, through our work, to also create opportunities in areas where not many economic opportunities exist. So that's a kind of secondary goal which fits under the main mission of the company.
And that's what makes Ishkar so unique, is you only work with countries that have been cut off from traditional markets by war and security. And by doing that, every purchase someone makes on ishkar.com provides an economic opportunity where it's most needed. And your most iconic product is a selection of colorful hand-blown glassware. It's made in, if my understanding is right, the last glass workshop in Afghanistan, an industry that has been around for about 2,000 years and is near extinction. This is so important, I want to call it out. So what you've created with Ishkar, a marketplace that connects these craftspeople to the larger world, is preserving crafts that have been around for 200, no, not 200,000, 2,000 years. That's truly incredible. Like, you're providing livelihood for these craftspeople and at the same time enabling consumers from around the world to appreciate and have a piece of this beautiful culture.
Yeah, yeah, and that's another thing that I didn't mention before, but which is very important to us, is also preserving craft traditions which are in danger of dying out. Again, which is typically a symptom of conflict, because craft industries are hugely important in developing economies. They're the second largest employer in developing economies after agriculture. So it's a hugely important sector, which is often perceived to be a sector which is slightly at the fringes of the formal economy. We associate it with cheap bracelets and things that you buy in bazaars, but it's a fundamental sector for many countries in the world that are growing economically. And what happens is, when war arrives, tourists disappear, and with that, one of the main markets for craft sellers disappears as well. And what's scary is that often the crafts that are being made, there are so many hundreds of thousands of different types of crafts, but often those crafts are only, the knowledge of how to make these objects are only held in the minds of a few artisans. So in the case that you mentioned, in the case of hand-blown glassware in Afghanistan, there is just one workshop left in Afghanistan making this glass with 3 glass blowers. And once these glass blowers stop their craft, that will be the end of this very specific form of glass blowing in Afghanistan, because all the knowledge is in their heads. And so these things are lost very quickly, and then it's very difficult to get them back again. So what we're trying to do is make sure that they have an international market before they disappear, and before a lot of these craft traditions are lost forever.
That is so beautiful and so important. So Ishkar buys up inventory, gives access to a larger market to these craftspeople, but you also collaborate with these craftsmen on new designs as well. Can you talk a little bit about that collaboration piece? What does that look like?
Yeah, so it really varies according to the product. But yeah, it's very important to us that we are not simply uh, either buying traditional products and selling them on, but we're either helping to carry the craft forward in collaboration with the artisans, with new designers, or with designers within the countries where we work. So we do that with a number of different products. Um, the most new designs that we work with is usually in jewelry, and we work with a number of incredibly talented local artisans and designers who create their own designs, and which we then help sell in international markets. And if just to give you a sense of one of these designers, one of them is called Saida Etabari, who has been designing. She's really self-trained. She's been designing jewelry from a very young age, and she works in the old city of Kabul and produces some of our most kind of iconic pieces that we sell on our website.
I love that. And I feel like that also, again, builds the mix of the old and the new, which there's so
Yeah,
much beauty there.
absolutely. Yeah, I think often we get frustrated that people kind of say, "Are you a modern brand or are you a traditional brand?" And we get slightly frustrated with the um, common understanding of tradition. People see tradition as fixed in a particular time or place, which is very much arbitrary. They have they have a conception of what tradition means, but it's often something that which is, you know, usually in like the 19th century somewhere where where something hasn't changed. But our understanding of tradition is that tradition is something that's constantly evolving, and each generation has a role in shaping where that tradition goes next. And so it's not something that cannot be touched and needs to be kept in a museum, or certain designs need to be always followed by. No, actually, artisans and designers have a really important role of bringing old traditions into, and influence them with their own concepts, and that carries tradition forward. It actually gives tradition vitality, and so much of what we're doing is trying to inject new vitality into old traditions, and so that they can continue to flourish into the future.
And that really is like the definition of art, right? Art isn't static, it continues to evolve and express in different ways. Um, Same as innovation, it's this
Yeah,
continuing to evolve and express.
absolutely. But people accept that of art, of contemporary art. That's people what people want, is what people accept. But people have slightly different opinions of craft when it comes to tradition. There's a sense that it's more sacred, some of these traditions, and that they shouldn't be meddled with or adapted. And that's not really our view. Our view is to to certainly preserve tradition in many cases, but also that tradition is a robust thing that you can play with and help carry it forward. That's something that we understand in the art world, but we understand less in the craft world, and we're trying to change that.
Mm-hmm. And I think just pulling out, you know, there's that evolution piece, but then there's also what you're doing. If we go back to the glassware example, is ensuring that the knowledge of how something was done at one point in time is still preserved, and that that itself isn't lost. So it can still be done in a way it's been done before, and remixed in a new way from the way it's been done before. So it's keeping all of those options open.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And it's in our name as a company. So the name Ishkar is the name in northern Afghanistan that's given to a pretty unremarkable looking desert shrub that shepherds for centuries have harvested, and they burn this plant in these huge sand pits. And when they burn it, it turns into a black hard soot. And that soot is mixed in with the glass mixture. And it's what gives our glasses their very bright, vibrant colors. And so it's a very complicated process. It's probably not the most efficient. I mean, we know it's not the most efficient way to make glassware, but there is something about using that traditional technique which is very important to keep going, because it does give the glasses a very, very distinctive feel that you don't get with chemical dyes. So yeah, that's a classic example of why it's important in certain instances to make sure that we don't lose not only the knowledge of how to form something with our hands, but all the other things that go into a craft object, where to source the materials, how, the alchemy that goes into turning an unremarkable looking desert shrub in a desert in northern Afghanistan into a fine piece of colored glassware. And that's kind of what really excites us about what we're doing.
I love that you use the word alchemy. I mean, that really is such a good descriptor of that entire process you just described. Now, I want to touch on something else. So, my understanding is that you came from the NGO world. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right.
Um,
Yes. So I
and
used to work for go for it.
I was gonna say I actually did too, working with traditional artisans in Morocco. That was my
Okay,
job
great.
through the NGO space. But now you intentionally decided when you built Ishkar to make it a business instead of a charity organization. And I want to just hear a little bit about why you chose that direction.
Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, it wasn't necessarily a straightforward one, but um, we feel that there is a very important space in the ecosystem for NGOs, and then there's a place for businesses and something that businesses can only do. So, I saw how in Afghanistan, aid has been a colossal failure over the last 20 years of international involvement in Afghanistan. The US government alone has spent considerably more than the Marshall Plan. And yet the results are, are, are very dubious. You look at education, look at infrastructure in the country, you look at corruption, look at a lot of typical metrics. And for the amount of money that's been spent, the results have been quite poor. So aid is not always a very effective solution, to put it in very crude terms. But in looking at the craft sector specifically, when I was working for an NGO called Turquoise Mountain, which is doing really extraordinary work in the rehabilitation of historic buildings and in supporting the craft sector, they have one issue, which is that they were training artisans and providing them with space, and then they were trying to help the artisans sell their work, and they were having a good deal of success with that. But what I saw was slightly perverse incentives where actually what happens when an NGO is supporting an artisan is that they are the NGO doesn't want to see that artisan business they support fail, because their metric is keeping businesses alive. And whilst that is good in the short term, what it means is a lot of the artisan businesses that were being supported were not developing, and they would continue to produce poor quality products. We want to set up Ishkar because the incentives are so much more simple with a business. We buy artisan products from an artisan group because they're a high quality, excellent product. If that product isn't good enough, we'll either find a new artisan group, or we'll work extremely hard to bring them up to the level that is required to turn that into a commercial product. And so in that way, I believe that private business is much better placed for the long-term development of artisan businesses. And you can see that across industries. It's not just the craft sector, but if you're someone selling pomegranate in Afghanistan, and you have an NGO supporting you to sell pomegranate to Europe, that NGO is much worse placed than a supermarket in the UK asking for a very specific type of pomegranate juice that they'd want for their supermarket. It is exactly that sort of pressure which is useful to enable faster, more sustainable, more robust economic development in somewhere like Afghanistan.
I 100% agree. I think the reason why business has such an opportunity to make a systemic impact is that it does respond more nimbly to market needs. And if we take the instance of you working with craftspeople, these craftspeople have had businesses in the past. Like it was a business before, supply meeting demand. And so now you're just helping them find new demand, right?
Yeah.
But also by working through business, you tap into scalability in a way that you're not able to with NGOs, because businesses are making profit, they are sustainable, right? So you can keep making more and more widgets, the more people want to buy widgets. And that in and of itself has so much power for creating economic opportunity for the people who need it, and doing it in a way that's sustainable long term.
Yeah, absolutely. And Afghanistan is a great case study in this because of the huge volume of aid funding that it has received, that has spawned a huge number of NGOs. And with the withdrawal of troops, the aid budget in Afghanistan has fallen sharply. And as those aid projects have fallen off, a lot of the economic development projects supporting businesses have also fallen away, leaving those businesses in a place where they're not properly prepared for competitive international market setting. So, with Ishkar, we are trying to be sustainable. We believe that through sales, we have a better shot of being sustainable than relying on donor funding in the long term. The trade-off, of course, is that development can be slower. So with Ishkar, we're growing organically. We've made a conscious decision not to take investment. And so every year we're growing. We've doubled in size every year for the last 3 years, but the growth has been much slower than if we were to have won a $3 million contract from USA to do this, to support the artisan sector. So in the immediate term, NGOs can create a big impact, but in the long term, I do think businesses are better set up to deliver deliver effective development outcomes.
I think that's a great distinction. So you talked about the growth of your company over the last few years. How have you expanded both the roster of your craftspeople, so the ones that you're working with and whose goods you're selling, as well as increasing visibility to consumers so that they know what you're doing?
Yeah, so in terms of expanding our the craftspeople that we're working with, we we have moved into new countries. So now, yeah, we're working in Yemen, Syria. We're working with refugee populations in Lebanon. We're working in Mali and Burkina Faso. Um, uh, and so we've expanded into new markets, but we're doing so very gradually. It's very important to us that the artisans that we started working with, we're very much trying to build upon their work and to keep working with those artisans. So we're supplying them with a steady sales, and that's why we don't do collections. So we pretty much every product that we've designed, we keep on the site and we hold it there. So these are pieces that are not seasonal. They stay on the site and they generate steady revenue for artisans. And in terms of getting the word out there, we've done so almost completely without digital ad spend. We only started investing in digital ads at the beginning of this year, because we feel that actually a lot of people who find their way to us come through an attraction to the story or the impact potential of what we do, and that's much better communicated through podcasts like this or through newspaper articles. And so a lot of our getting the word out there has been through the press rather than being through traditional marketing, or not traditional but new marketing techniques.
That's incredible. I mean, word of mouth is so important, and um, stories are what people talk about and what they gravitate towards. And the story of what you have created and the reason behind it, what you're doing, is really compelling and really unique. Um,
Yeah. Yeah, and that's we the metric that we care about most is the returning customer metric on our website. So that's the number that we spend most time thinking about, is how, once our customers have purchased once from us, what's going to make them purchase again, and how can we keep them loyal over the lifetime of our company. So we dedicate a lot of our marketing attention to building a loyal tribe around the mission of what we're doing, rather than necessarily reaching large amounts of new audiences who are attracted to the site just because of one particular product. We're trying to bring our audience into our whole universe, and that way we hope that people will stay with us throughout our journey.
that's awesome. Now, on your site, you also talk about collaborating with NGOs, development organizations, and other social enterprises to amplify your impact. Can you share a little bit about what that looks like?
Absolutely, yeah. So one of the challenges that we have when working with countries that are affected by conflict is that banks don't like us sending money there. So if you try and open a bank account in the UK and you say that you're going to trade with Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Yemen, they won't open your bank account, and they will block all transactions there. So initially, we started working with NGOs as a way to pay our artisans in a safe way. So we have a network of international NGOs who have international bank accounts, and we pay them and they pay our artisans. So it started off with this quite simple um, uh, way of handling this early problem that we experienced with the business. Since then, it's evolved into a much more formal relationship. So a lot of the NGOs we work with help us verify that the artisans that we're working with are being paid fairly, and that they work in good working conditions, and that we know exactly where every dollar that we spend ends up. So they also help us with that service, and they also often help us with quality controlling products, third-party quality control before they're shipped to us in the UK. So often NGOs provide that screen as well. So it's become a really amazing symbiotic relationship in many ways. We help NGOs who are supporting artisans by giving their artisans access to a market, and the NGOs help us by overcoming some of the business challenges that we have when working in difficult places.
I never would have considered that bit about the bank. That's so interesting and so resourceful on your part. I would love to hear, actually, that brings me to another question, a bit more about your supply chain and the approach you've taken, because you're working with these artisans who are in very challenging environments in countries that have been isolated due to global events, which in and of itself poses a number of problems, like the banking one you just mentioned. But on top of that, you also try to use within the products that you sell recycled materials, and you try to purchase through local NGOs, ensuring that a portion of the money you invest is recycled back into development projects. So, what are some of the other challenges you've run into in the supply chain side, and what are some of the bright spots that have worked really well?
Yeah, I mean, how long have we got for the challenges? I mean, there's there is a whole host. I think specific to working in countries which are fundamentally unstable from a security perspective is that the borders often close, often randomly. And we've had goods stuck at the border for months at a time. We've also had difficulty with goods being held at the border. And then to give you one example, we had a big shipment of these beautiful walnut trays that we sell on our site held at the Afghan-Pakistan border. And the border guards said that they would, to check there weren't any drugs inside, they would drill a hole through all the trays to make sure, even though that they've got they've got some very fancy scanner machines that have been given to them by the US government, unless of course we paid a hefty fee to release them, and in that instance we were able to get the trays back and we didn't move them across that border. We shipped them by air, but that's quite a common challenge that we have, facing corruption or facing closed borders. And over time, we've kind of worked out how to mitigate who we work with, at least, to avoid the corruption dangers. But there's some things you just can't plan for, and closed borders is a real pain. Yeah, so that's those are kind of typical challenges. But then, as a small business, I would actually say those types of challenges come pretty low down the list. Really, the most challenges we face are like any small business. We're mostly thinking about our cash flow for the month. We're thinking about how we're going to reach new audiences. We're thinking about how to get a product developed quickly that we think is going to work for a certain season. We're constantly having those questions on top of our mind, rather than necessarily the questions you might think working in unstable countries.
That's so interesting. Yeah, most people don't have to worry about borders randomly being closed within their small business as well. A new complexity. Now I want to go back to something we talked about a little bit at the start. So one of the things Ishkar does is tell a different narrative and show different sides of the countries that you operate in, right? So disrupting the singular narrative that's told within headlines. And you do that from a lot of different approaches. So or mediums, from film to writing to photography, to show different perspectives of these countries. As you say, venturing behind the headlines, I want to talk a little bit about an example of a story you've put out there and how it's been received, the impact that you've seen from that storytelling piece.
Yeah, I'm just trying to think of a good one. I mean, yeah. So one story that we found has had a very has had a big impact is it's often the stories where you put something out which is completely surprising to people. So one of our first products that we sold were these carpets, which were designed by Frank Gehry and Zaha Hadid, which are two of some of the world's best known architects. And they were woven in a village in the center of Afghanistan, which economically it's one of the poorest regions in one of the poorest countries in the world. And yet the carpets that were produced were so incredibly fine, such incredible quality, that when we told this story and we showed people these products, people were completely blown away. And then you say they're from Afghanistan, and people look at you like you're lying to them in a terrible way. But people are they're so used to seeing these images of war, of deserts, um, of bomb blasts, and when you put in front of them a product which has over 1 million knots that have been done by hand, has been made by three weavers over 6 months, and it's the sort of piece that you could put in any museum in the world and it would catch people's eye. That really makes an impression on people, and I think is really important way of teaching people a kind of a lesson that they don't forget quickly, which is that they might not have a full understanding of the country that they read about in the news.
That is so interesting. How did the design of the two architects come about? How that collaboration?
So this was another collaboration with an NGO called Arzu, which is a US-based NGO, and they were the ones who formed this partnership with these architects, and then we were brought on to get them out there. And they're some of my favorite pieces on our website.
That's incredible. Um, I'm a huge believer in the importance of narrative and visibility. You know, actions are what create change, but visibility changes culture and it influences culture. And through that change in culture, it changes people's actions. It's like this beautiful cycle and circle. And what you're doing with your business has both of those pieces. You have the action piece of working with these artists, giving them a marketplace, working with them on new designs as well. And then you also have the visibility piece of telling these new narratives and showing these new stories that most people wouldn't be exposed to.
Mm. Yeah, I like that. Yeah, and what we're constantly experimenting with new ways to kind of tell this story. So when we started out, we had this theory that objects can tell very powerful stories because um, if you know exactly where the glass in your hand has come from and you know who made it and it lives in your kitchen, every time you use it, there's a chance you might think about that. There's a chance you might be reminded this this glass was made in Western Afghanistan in a small workshop, um, and it was made by Ghulam Sahi, and we know this because we've received all this information about it. That might actually be a constant reminder for you about what another side of Afghanistan that you're not used to reading about. So we started out with that kind of this belief that we called it object journalism, could kind of help change people's actions, change people's perceptions of a place. And then our latest theory is really that actually travel is probably the single most powerful way of changing the way people experience a place, and therefore how they will act when they meet people from that country. So since we've started our trips to Afghanistan, I think that's really been borne out. Everyone we've taken to Afghanistan has left with um, having had a pretty formative experience, and they really amplify that message about what Afghanistan is like to everyone that they meet when they come back home. So we're constantly trying to find the right way to get our message across, and we're experimenting with new medium all the time to see what's the most powerful way of doing it.
I would love for you to share more about the travel piece of your business you started. I was taking a look at the trips that you offer on the website, and they literally make me giddy. So, can you share a bit about these unique experiences that you offer?
Yeah, so our trips are often led by what we call masters. So they have a particular expert knowledge that they share during the trip. And we always travel to places where very few tourists go. So to give you an example, in May, we're traveling with a small group of 8 people to northern Pakistan, right up near the Chinese border. And we're traveling with a Pakistani guide and also with a National Geographic photographer called Mathieu Paley. And Mathieu has lived in this part of Pakistan for a number of years and speaks Urdu. And he is teaching the people on the trip how to tell stories through photography as we travel. So they're not like formal workshops, but um, all our trips have a kind of storytelling element, and that's why we often have our trips led by photographers. Um, Early in the year, we visited the DRC as well with with an American photojournalist called Michael Christopher Brown, and again, the whole theme of that trip was seeing a side to the Democratic Republic of Congo, which is rarely seen, whilst also learning about how to tell your own story about this country through photography. Not all our trips are surrounding photography. We have a trail running trip in the middle of Afghanistan, taking place, COVID permitting, towards the end of next year. And we also do skiing trips in Afghanistan as well, which are led by Afghanistan's 2 national ski champions. So yeah, we have a wide range of different trips, but their theme is that you leave the trip not only having traveled somewhere where tourists don't usually go, but also with a new skill, whether that's storytelling or whether it's about trail running or skiing, for instance.
Those are so unique. I actually, my childhood dream, little news, was to be a National Geographic photographer, which is why when I was looking at the experiences, the trips you put together, I'm like, these are amazing to actually travel around a country with a National Geographic photographer. Um, you don't find that anywhere else.
Yeah, we've been very lucky with the photographers that we've been able to work with, and I think really it's not so much about the photography at all, although what they teach about photography is very cool. But actually, it's just the way that photographers tend to travel and tend to move through a place. We found that they're often very mindful when they're traveling. They often travel at a pace where they're picking up stories, they're seeing things that you might just pass you by if you're a tourist and you're not pausing, looking for images, looking for stories to tell. And so they just unlock a whole new perspective of a place which you might not pick up if you're just traveling in a normal way.
That's incredible. I also want to go back to what you said about the objects as stories. And as you were talking about the glassware, if you have it in your house and every time you pick it up, you're going to remember where that came from, that also becomes a conversation piece, right? If I own that glassware and you come over to my house, I'm going to tell you the story about it and where it came from and who made it. And and share that story with the other people I invite into my home. Like that, those are the stories that
Mm.
travel onwards and enable new connections.
Mm. Yeah, that's very much our hope, and I think consumers now are much more. It's a good moment for it because consumers are increasingly looking to have maybe fewer objects, but for the objects they own to carry more meaning to them and to reflect their values.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and I think it's a relatively new phenomenon, although of course people have always coveted objects for their storytelling power. But I think particularly at the moment there's a trend of a consumer trend of people really wanting to have more control over the objects in their house and have some connection to them, particularly as we're becoming more mindful of our consumption and its impact on the environment. Um, there's more importance to have fewer things which are well made that are going to last a long time and which speak something about you as a person and your identity.
Yeah, being intentional about what it is that you surround yourself with.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So, as you think about the future, um, what do you want to see for the future of your business?
We have many different ideas um, because we have this very broad mission of changing the way people think about countries, and so under that falls all sorts of things, and we're terrible business people. So um, being terrible business people allows us to the freedom to kind of do what we want. So one of the ideas that we've been talking about recently is having a record label for the countries in which we work, and we're going to start out next month. We're starting our own playlist with music from the places where we're working. Also, before the pandemic, we had monthly events in our shop space in London, where we'd have panel discussions on anything from architecture through to the hippie trail in Afghanistan in the 60s. Pretty diverse range of events, and we're really going to focus more on that once lockdown ends here in London, and do more surrounding food as well. So do more pop-up restaurant evenings. So yeah, so we're going to grow in multiple diverse, incoherent incoherent ways, but our main aim is to kind of have fun underneath that broad social mission.
I think it's funny the words you chose to use, um, that not standard business people, but I think there is such a important benefit to not being the average business person, is that you're creating your own playbook, instead of following what you think is supposed to be done, right? You're creating something that's never been created before. And there's so much beauty in that and opportunity and possibility in that.
Hmm. Yeah, and our hope is that I think there's a very bright future for brands which have a very particular voice and they have their own universe. That's how we like to describe it. We have you can touch Ishkar at multiple different points, whether you're coming to an event or you're going traveling or you want to buy an object. And because you can touch Ishkar at so many different events, we're building a very strong, very loyal community around what we're doing. And so it's 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 very different to a big corporation or having the ambition to be a big corporation. What we're trying to build is a community of like-minded people, and we're doing it in a very unusual way. And so, who knows? In the short term, it's probably a terrible business move. It is a terrible business move. In the long term, I do think there is a bright future for this type of social enterprise.
I agree. And as you were talking about the way that you envision Ishkar expanding, the image that came to mind for me was as you're storytelling about these places that have been cut off from the world and showing different perspectives of them, it's almost like you're finding different ways to expand across the five senses. So, enabling humans to really get a deeper understanding of these places through all of our available senses.
Yeah, I love that. That's put it coherently, which I was struggling to, but it's very much true. It's what we're drawn to with objects, with touch and with travel, which is sight, and very much through events, which is often sound and smell. But yeah, I
Mm-hmm.
think that's a very good way of putting it. We think that the best stories are told through this combination of stimulating different senses, and so that is what we hope to do in the long term.
And I have a theory, which I'll share with you. I feel like the most memorable things are the things that touch more than one sense. It's why, like, if you're reading a book, at least for me, if I'm reading a physical one, I retain the information more because I also have the tangible physical book. I
Yeah,
remember kind of
yeah,
where it was on the page versus electronically, every page looks exactly the same. It's like the more of those senses you bring into an experience, the more sticky the experience ends up being.
yeah, yeah. I love that. I think that's very true. Yeah.
So we're coming to the end of this conversation. Thank you so much for your time. I want to ask, is there anything that we didn't touch on that you want to share?
Not particularly. No, I think I really enjoyed our discussion, and thank you very much for having me on the podcast.
Thank you for coming. And call out to your website. So to find out more, go to Ishkar, ishkar.com to browse objects, browse once in a lifetime trips, look at the different storytelling you're putting out, and the impact that you're making within the world. So thank you
Brilliant.
so much for joining.